The best wisdom is to recognize one's own limitations. Peter Biplin. If you've ever believed you were thinking correctly, only for the outcome to be a devastating failure, where did the problem lie? Was it due to insufficient data? Were your emotions at play? Or was it an underlying thought model you weren't even aware you were using? Perhaps you've read dozens of self-help books, memorized logical thinking techniques, and practiced emotional control. But in the end, there's still a silent question you haven't answered. Why? Despite good intentions and ample knowledge, people consistently make wrong judgments. This book doesn't aspire to cure the shortcomings of human intelligence. It doesn't paint the ability to think as an omnipotent light. On the contrary, it points directly to the dark corners where instinct, bias, and even excessive cleverness secretly distort the way we see the world. Wisdom is not advice, but a complex map drawn from mistakes, a map that highlights the pitfalls most of us have fallen into, sometimes repeatedly, without even realizing it. Dare you read this book as if holding a mirror to yourself? And if you see a face distorted by long-held illusions, do you have the courage not to turn away? If so, then proceed. But don't expect comforting words. There will only be the chillingly accurate, yet necessary, dissection of thought. Now, let's begin to summarize this book. Part 1. What influences how we think? We often think of ourselves as rational beings who make decisions based on data and logic. But if you've ever argued with a friend about politics, stocks, or football, you'll realize there's an invisible force influencing how we think. Sometimes, it's stronger than the truth itself. I wrote this book not to teach you how to think correctly, but to help you understand why you often make mistakes. I'm fascinated by seemingly simple questions. Why do two people with the same information arrive at completely different conclusions? Why do we easily make the same mistakes repeatedly, even after paying a hefty price? And how can we overcome our own limitations to think better? To answer these questions, I didn't turn to superficial self-help books. I sought out Charles Darwin, who spent his life observing nature and humanity with a cold, unyielding eye. I sought out Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, a person who relentlessly dissects his own mistakes like a surgeon. I observe human behavior the way a biologist watches whales from afar, patiently and without judgment. We start with what seems to be the simplest thing, the brain. This biological structure, with billions of neurons, chemical reactions, and electrical signals, is the machine that processes everything we call the world. But this machine has its limitations. We cannot see the entire picture, cannot remember every detail, and are often influenced by invisible things like emotions, memories, and personal beliefs. Imagine stepping into a room full of strangers. You immediately look around to assess who is safe, who might be a threat. But these judgments don't come from logic. They come from instincts that have evolved over millions of years. Facial recognition, reacting to eye contact, remembering body odor. We don't think like machines. We feel, react, and sometimes only rationalize afterward. Darwin once wrote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change." And that adaptability comes from our continuous learning from the environment. Yet, ironically, our brains are programmed to love familiarity. We repeat old behaviors, believe old stories, and fear what is different. It's a paradox. To adapt, we must change, but to feel safe, we cling to the old. That's why the same event can lead to completely different interpretations. Think about reading the news. Two people read the same article, but one feels indignant while the other remains calm. It's not because the article is different, but because their thinking systems, the filters in their brains, are different. We don't see the world as it is, but as we are. Another factor shaping our thinking is culture. I'm not talking about music or cuisine, but the invisible beliefs we absorb from family, society, and media. If you grew up in a family that believed successful people must struggle, you'll view ease with suspicion. If you were taught that money is the root of all evil, you'll feel guilty when you earn a lot. And if you live in a society that values diplomas over wisdom, you'll learn to hide your ignorance instead of being curious. An interesting experiment illustrates this. Scientists showed a group of Japanese and Americans the same picture, a village scene with a large fish swimming among smaller fish. When asked what they saw, the Americans typically said, "A large fish." The Japanese described the surrounding scene, the water, and the small fish. Culture had programmed them to notice different things, the individual or the context. This leads to a key question. If everything from biology, emotions, to culture influences our thinking, is there such a thing as objective thinking, or is it just an illusion? And if it's an illusion, how can we trust our own decisions? The problem isn't that our brain is wrong, but that it's designed to make quick decisions, sometimes faster than conscious perception. Return to primeval times. A sound in the bush could be wind or a beast. The person who fled without hesitation had a higher chance of survival than the one who stopped to think. So, we evolved to prioritize reaction over analysis, and that mechanism remains in our brains, even if today the thing in the bush is just a social media notification. But that very speed is a double-edged sword. It makes us label others at first glance. It makes us cling to an opinion before truly understanding the whole issue. It makes us repeat old behavioral patterns, not because they are effective, but because they are familiar. And when challenged, instead of questioning, we reinforce false beliefs by seeking supporting evidence, a mechanism called confirmation bias. Imagine you believe a certain stock will rise. You scroll through dozens of articles and only stop at one with the headline, "Investors pour money into stock X." You read it as confirmation of your belief, ignoring conflicting analyses. And if the stock falls, you don't doubt your judgment but find ways to justify it. The market overreacted, or bad news is only temporary. That's how the brain protects the ego by distorting reality. Another factor strongly influencing thought is memory. We often imagine we remember the past accurately. But in reality, memory is not a faithful recording, it's a reconstructive process. Each time we recall, we rewrite details that fit current beliefs, keeping what's consistent and omitting what conflicts. And so, the story in our heads constantly changes, not according to truth, but according to internal needs. Charlie Munger once said, "Learn to reflect, ask not where I am right, but where I might be wrong." But that requires courage. Courage to admit that what we believe might just be a product of circumstance, instinct, and bias. Courage to peel back layers of perception to face a world far grayer than we imagined. Think of an everyday situation. You go to a restaurant and have a bad experience. The next time someone mentions that restaurant, you immediately dismiss it. Don't go, it's terrible. But perhaps the chef was sick that day, or you were in a bad mood. You judge an entire system based on a single interaction, and that sticks in your mind as truth. That's how prejudice forms, quickly, simply, and very difficult to correct. Yet, it's not hopeless. The starting point of good thinking is self-awareness, understanding that we, too, are easily fooled by ourselves. We cannot completely eliminate biases, but we can learn to identify them. Like a sailor who cannot control the wind but can adjust the sails. An effective strategy is probabilistic thinking. Instead of asking, "Am I right or wrong?" ask, "What is the probability that I am right?" This forces us to assess risks, test assumptions, and view things in a broader context. It also helps us be more open to new information, because we don't need to defend an absolute argument, we are merely adjusting our confidence based on data. Probabilistic thinking also means accepting uncertainty, and this is what makes many people uncomfortable. Our brain loves certainty, it makes us feel in control. But the world doesn't operate that way. There are things we don't know, and there are things we don't know that we don't know. Recognizing this is the first step to wisdom. And wisdom doesn't come from having more information, but from knowing how limited we are in processing that information. You can read hundreds of books, but if you don't know how to read yourself, your biases, prejudices, fears, and old beliefs, you'll remain stuck in an old mental box. One of the most powerful tools to see ourselves more clearly is the concept of mental models. Charlie Munger called it a latticework of mental models, a collection of fundamental principles from various fields like biology, psychology, physics, economics, and mathematics. They help us see the world not just through one lens, but through multiple, intersecting, and complementary lenses. For example, from psychology, we can recognize confirmation bias. From economics, we learn about scarcity and incentives. From physics, we understand nonlinear systems, where small inputs can yield huge results. From biology, we learn about natural selection and adaptation. When we combine them, we see a more complex, but also more authentic, world. Instead of seeking a single universal formula, we learn to view each situation with the most appropriate pair of glasses. But this requires intellectual humility, a rare quality in the modern world, where everyone wants to show off what they know. Humility doesn't mean doubting oneself to the point of paralysis, but understanding that all our knowledge might be wrong or incomplete. It's a readiness to re-question instead of clinging to answers. One of the most frightening manifestations of flawed thinking is when it becomes collectivized, when a group of people shares a bias and reinforces it among themselves. This phenomenon is called groupthink. You can see it in boardrooms, in politics, or in a corporate meeting room. When no one dares to speak against the tide, the collective slides into error with the belief that everyone agrees. There's a famous experiment where a person was placed in a group of volunteers. All were asked to identify the length of 3 lines. The answer was obvious, but all the others deliberately chose the wrong one. The real subject, fearing to be different, eventually chose the wrong answer like the majority, not because they didn't see correctly, but because they feared exclusion. This is the root of many major historical mistakes, from financial bubbles to senseless wars. When people don't dare to speak against the current, error becomes truth, and the consequence is disaster. Good thinking, therefore, is not just a personal skill, it is an act of courage. Courage to think differently, to stand alone when necessary, to doubt what is considered obvious. But it's also important to distinguish between healthy skepticism and blind conspiracy theories. True skepticism aims for deeper understanding, not unfounded opposition. We need to learn to ask the right questions, not "how can I be right?" but "what if I'm wrong?" Not "what does everyone else think?" but "what do I see that they don't?" And not "is this the truth?" but "what evidence makes me think it's the truth? And is there any evidence to the contrary?" Darwin had an admirable habit. Whenever he encountered evidence contrary to his hypothesis, he recorded it immediately, because he knew that if he didn't, he would forget or intentionally ignore it. That is the thinking of someone who seeks not affirmation, but truth. And that is what we need to learn. Instead of trying to prove ourselves right, let's try to understand why we might be wrong. Instead of clinging to a simple and predictable world, let's learn to live with complexity and ambiguity. Instead of chasing optimal tools, let's build a solid cognitive foundation from fundamental principles. Ultimately, good thinking doesn't guarantee you'll always be right, but it helps you make fewer mistakes. And when you do make mistakes, it helps you know how to correct them. It doesn't protect you from pain or failure, but it helps you learn more from each stumble. And most importantly, it grants you a rare privilege in this noisy world: cognitive autonomy and freedom of thought. I was once asked, if I could teach only one thing about thinking, what would it be? I thought long and hard. And the answer is, learn to see the world as a system, not a series of disconnected events, but a network of interacting, influencing, and feedback looping elements. When you understand systemic thinking, you'll stop looking for single causes and start asking deeper questions about context, relationships, and ripple effects. Take the example of a company losing money. People might say it's due to a weak director or an unsuitable product. But if you view it as a system, you'll ask, has there been a change in market demand? Are there any macro factors at play? What are competitors doing? Is there a bottleneck in the distribution system? And even, is the internal compensation structure creating misaligned behaviors? Systemic thinking doesn't seek to blame, but to understand mechanisms. It doesn't stop at the surface, but delves into the structure. It forces you to recognize that many complex problems cannot be solved with simple solutions. Sometimes, the solution itself is part of the problem. Another important consequence of systemic thinking is understanding lag the time between action and result. Many people give up too soon because they don't see immediate results. But in systems, feedback doesn't come instantly. A correct decision might be misunderstood as wrong in the short term, and a wrong action might yield short-term rewards before the true consequences appear. Also in systems, we learn about positive and negative feedback loops. Positive feedback loops amplify trends, the more results, the more investment, creating even more results. But if that trend is wrong, it will amplify the error. Financial bubbles are a typical example. Meanwhile, negative feedback loops help to adjust, slow down, and stabilize the system. Those who reflect on themselves are such an adjustment mechanism in personal thinking. But the hardest thing about systemic thinking isn't understanding the models, it's letting go of simplicity. We love stories with clear beginnings, middles, and ends, but the world doesn't operate linearly. There are phenomena that occur not in a clear cause and effect chain, but as a cloud of nonlinear interactions. And if you're not ready to live with that, you'll always be surprised and hurt by the unpredictable. Therefore, another important principle is prudence, not fear, but respect for complexity. You don't need to know everything to act, but you need to be aware enough to know what you might be missing. And when making decisions, allow for error. Never bet everything on a single assumption. That is not the path of the wise, but of the arrogant. In my learning journey, I discovered that the sharpest thinkers are not the most intelligent in the traditional sense, but the most humble. They don't rush to conclusions, they listen more than they speak, and they are always willing to adjust their beliefs when new data emerges. That is a quality you can cultivate, starting by asking yourself, what makes me believe what I believe? Thinking is not a subject, it's a way of life. You can't learn it and then put it away. It requires daily practice in every conversation, every decision, every small reaction. The more you practice, the more you discover your blind spots in seeing the world. And it is precisely when you realize you don't see clearly that you begin to see truly. I have made countless mistakes thinking I understood. I have been overconfident, hasty, too attached to the familiar, and I have paid the price. But those failures were not in vain. They were the beginning of awakening. Not a mystical spiritual awakening, but a practical one, knowing that I am prone to error, easily deceived, and therefore must always learn, always correct, always be vigilant. You don't need to be a genius to think well. You just need to be honest with yourself, open to contradictory ideas, and persistent in practice. Thinking is a skill, and like all skills, it is honed through practice, not mere theory. And finally, perhaps the deepest thing I've learned in the journey to wisdom is that it all starts with attitude, not intelligence, not degrees, not experience, but attitude toward the world and toward oneself. A person may not know much, but if they have an attitude of learning, listening, and self-questioning, they will grow over time. Conversely, a person full of information but arrogant and defensive will only cycle within the loop of old perceptions. That attitude is curiosity, not a superficial curiosity, but an internal urge to understand deeper, to peel back the layers of things to reach their essence. It is courage daring to doubt even what one once believed to be certain, daring to accept one's wrongness without collapsing the ego. And it is patience understanding that progress in thinking doesn't come from an all-nighter, but from hundreds of self-reflections, adjustments, and relearning from scratch. Charlie Munger once said that one of his biggest regrets was not starting earlier in documenting his own thinking errors. Because we forget quickly. Yesterday's mistake is easily erased by today's ego. And if we don't honestly record those lessons, they drift away like faint scratches in memory, leaving no mark on future behavior. Therefore, I advise you, if you can, to keep a cognitive diary, not to judge yourself, but to observe yourself like a scientist observing a mouse in a lab. What are you thinking? How do you react to new information? What biases do you have when judging others? Are you seeking information to reinforce your views or to challenge them? Over time, you will realize a miracle. You gradually become less certain but understand more deeply. You will make fewer conclusions, but each conclusion will be based on a firmer foundation. You will say, I know less and I am learning more. And that is not a sign of weakness, but evidence of maturity in thinking. We live in an era where information is more abundant than ever, but wisdom is scarce. Anyone can access millions of data points with a few clicks, but very few know how to interpret, connect, and apply them effectively. Because the core lies not in the data, but in how we think about the data, not in the answers, but in the quality of the questions. I don't write these things for you to become some thinking expert. I write them as a reminder that thinking is a lifelong endeavor, that everyone can think more clearly, more precisely, more humanely if they are willing to train, and that there are no shortcuts. There is only a long-term commitment to improving step by step. You may never reach ultimate wisdom. But if you think better than yesterday, if you make fewer mistakes and learn more from those mistakes, then you are living in the orbit of intellectual evolution, and evolution that is not noisy, not ostentatious, but utterly essential. And I believe that in a world full of noise and blind faith, those who truly take the effort to think, and think well, will be the ones who make a difference. Part 2, The Psychology of Poor Judgment. Mistakes, if you dare to face them, are the strictest but most honest teachers life can offer. No one can avoid mistakes. But what makes us different is not the number of times we err, but how we think about them. Poor judgments from trivial daily decisions to major life missteps all stem from one source, our own minds. There are obvious mistakes, like buying an unnecessary item, choosing the wrong career, or loving the wrong person. But there are also more subtle errors, conclusions that seem logical, reactions that feel instinctive, perspectives that appear clear. These turn out to be the results of a series of distorted psychological mechanisms that we don't recognize. I call this the psychology of poor judgment, a dense jungle full of invisible traps laid by evolution, emotions, memories, and old beliefs. If we don't learn to identify them, we'll step into them unknowingly, and then stumble, repeating the same mistakes until there's no turning back. Let's start with one of the most common traps, the illusion of understanding. You step into a situation, observe a few signs, draw a conclusion, and believe you know what's happening. But in reality, you don't. You're superimposing fragmented past experiences onto the present and calling it intuition. Imagine you see someone shabbily dressed, stammering, and unsteady. Your brain immediately judges, this person is untrustworthy. But if you knew he had just escaped an accident or suffers from a neurological disorder, everything would be different. You weren't wrong due to a lack of information. You were wrong because you rushed to conclude from an incomplete picture. Charlie Munger emphasized that the illusion of knowledge is the most dangerous thing because it stops you from seeking the truth. And this is the gateway to dozens of other cognitive biases that I will help you dissect one by one. First is the anchoring effect, one of the brain's most common tricks. When you hear an initial number, however random, all subsequent assessments revolve around that number. If I ask whether the price of this item is higher or lower than 5 million, you've been anchored to 5 million, even though the actual price might only be 2 million. If I ask higher or lower than 20 million, your answer will be different, even for the same item. We think we make decisions based on intrinsic value, but in reality, we are strongly influenced by random starting points. In everyday life, from negotiations, sales, and investments to judging people, these subtle anchors appear constantly, leading us astray from the truth without our knowing. Then comes confirmation bias, a brain mechanism that makes us seek out information that aligns with existing beliefs and ignore or deny contradictory data. If you believe that successful people must wake up early, you will only remember stories like Tim Cook or Howard Schultz waking up at 4 a.m., and forget that Winston Churchill often slept until noon. Your brain will edit reality to rationalize your beliefs, not to verify if they are true or false. Confirmation bias is why arguments are often useless. Each person isn't truly listening, but merely trying to reinforce their own argument. When someone offers a conflicting opinion, instead of reflecting, we activate a defensive mode. Logic is crushed by emotion. Truth is replaced by a version of truth favorable to the ego. And there's more. The halo effect makes us attribute all good qualities to a person simply because they have one outstanding trait. You see someone articulate and elegantly dressed, and immediately think they are intelligent, trustworthy, and successful. But that is merely the shadow of an initial impression, like seeing a shiny diamond and assuming it's priceless without knowing its purity, weight, or origin. But mistakes don't just come from how we see others, they also come from how we see ourselves. There's a bias called the illusion of superiority, where most people believe they are better than average. The irony is, if everyone is above average, who is below? The average student thinks they study well. The losing investor thinks they have a long-term vision. The bad driver thinks they just need to focus a little more. That's not confidence, that's an illusion. That illusion is further fueled by another bias, outcome bias. We judge decisions based on the result rather than the decision-making process. If someone bets all their assets on tech stocks and gets rich, we call them a genius. If they lose everything, we call them stupid. But in both cases, the right thing to evaluate is not the outcome, but the rationality of the decision at the time it was made. You can be right by chance. You can also be wrong even when you did everything right. This distinction is crucial, especially in fields with high probabilistic elements like investment, business, medicine, or strategy. Another common mistake is group behavior bias or groupthink, where we adjust our perceptions, even our ethics, to fit in with the collective. You see everyone in a group agreeing with a bad idea, and instead of opposing it, you keep silent. Afterward, you might even convince yourself that you must have been the one who was wrong. The brain cannot tolerate the feeling of exclusion, so it will distort reality to make us feel like we belong. This explains why large organizations can make fatal mistakes with no one daring to speak up. Even simple experiments have proven this. When an entire group deliberately chooses a wrong answer, individuals often follow along, even if they know in their hearts it's incorrect. When the air in the room is filled with false consensus, the truth is stifled, not by force, but by silence. And then comes loss aversion, where we hate losing more than we like winning. The negative emotion from losing $1 is stronger than the joy of gaining $1. That's why we tend to hold on to losing investments, hoping they will turn around instead of cutting losses at the right time. Meanwhile, with profitable investments, we rush to sell to lock in gains, fearing the profits will disappear. This is a paradox. We let losses run long and cut profits short. Loss aversion makes us prisoners of our own emotions. Instead of acting according to logic and long-term goals, we react to immediate fears. It also makes us make defensive decisions, even if the cost is much higher. Imagine you lose $1 million due to an incident. You might spend $5 million just to get justice, even though the actual loss is already done. A damaged ego sometimes costs us more than money. And at a deeper level, there exists a mechanism called post hoc rationalization. We do something impulsively, emotionally, even irrationally. Then afterward, we find reasons to justify it. The reasons come after the action, not before. We don't live by logic, but by instinct. Then we package that instinct with fabricated logic to convince ourselves. This is how the mind avoids cognitive dissonance, the pain of knowing one is irrational. A person buys a car twice their annual income. After the purchase, they start talking about safety, long-term value, stability. But in reality, the only reason was that they liked the feeling of driving, the emotion of being in the lead. Emotion leads, reason justifies. If you ask before buying, "Do you think you're acting rationally?" they might hesitate. But after the action, the answer will be, "Of course." That's why poor judgment is not an accident. It is an inevitable consequence of how the brain operates. And without the effort to identify, dissect, and learn, we will forever slide through a series of wrong decisions that seem right. Like a person walking in the fog, thinking they are walking in sunshine, only to realize when they fall into an abyss. Try stopping and observing your day. You will find yourself making many cognitive errors without even realizing it. You wake up, scroll through the news, and stop at headlines that match your views. You go on social media, see someone showcasing their achievements, and immediately attribute all positive qualities to them: intelligent, hardworking, leadership skills. You go out and meet someone shabbily dressed and don't give them a chance to finish their sentence. You have lunch at a familiar restaurant because you always go there. And in the evening, you sit back, look at your profit and loss statement, and tell yourself, "Today, I thought rationally." Our ego is very good at storytelling. It creates a smooth, logical narrative to rationalize a series of disjointed, emotional, and biased actions. We love good stories, especially when we are the main character. But if we don't stop to dissect the underlying mechanisms, that so-called thinking is just a rushed draft written in the darkness of the unconscious. And so we move on to a more dangerous form of bias, the identification of emotion with truth. Feeling scared doesn't mean you're in danger. Feeling confident doesn't mean you're going in the right direction. Feeling right doesn't mean you are right. But in the brain, emotion is the strongest data point. It can override logic, distort memory, and obscure warning signs. From emotion arises a consequence: irrationality in probability assessment. The human brain is not good at thinking in probabilities. We assess the risk of a plane crash as higher than a car accident because a plane crash is more dramatic. We fear sharks more than falling in the bathtub because sharks appear in movies. We assess the probability of a startup's success based on one person's success story, rather than overall statistics on the 90% failure rate. Emotion, attached to concrete images, makes us prioritize vivid information over accurate information. Let's call that the availability heuristic. If an example is easy to visualize, relatable, or emotionally charged, we assess its probability of happening as higher than reality. You hear stories of someone winning the lottery 3 times in a row and think, maybe I can too. You hear stories of startups raising capital at lightning speed and think, I have a great idea like that too. You remember the single time someone was saved by a strange treatment method and ignore statistics that it's ineffective in the other 99% of cases. Our brain dislikes emptiness. Where information is lacking, it will fill it in. But with what? With personal experience, fleeting emotions, old beliefs. And so, imagination is filled with memories, prejudices, media, and oversimplification. We don't assess things as they are, but as we can easily tell them. Availability heuristic is what media and advertising exploit to the fullest. They don't need to change the truth, they just need to tell a better story. A bizarre accident, a rare illness, a young entrepreneur who changed their life. Each such story becomes an anchor, a reminder, a vivid illustration for millions of people to believe that the world operates on an emotional logic. There's another type of bias, less discussed but very common, the sunk cost fallacy. You invest in a project that's already losing money, but because you've put in so much effort and capital, you can't stop. You continue to pour in hope because you feel regret for what's been lost. Logic tells you to cut losses, emotion tells you to save face. The result is that you dig deeper into the hole. The sunk cost fallacy makes us maintain toxic relationships, flawed ideas, and ineffective strategies just because we don't want our efforts to be in vain. But the truth is, money lost cannot be recovered. The only question is the next decision worth what you have left? If not, stop. Regret doesn't revive lost value, it only prolongs the loss. One of the most subtle mechanisms that leads us to make wrong judgments comes from evolution itself, the tendency to seek simple causes for complex phenomena. The human brain is designed for survival. It doesn't have time to analyze a tangled web of factors every time it encounters a situation. Instead, it will choose the story that is easy to understand, easy to remember, easy to tell, and assign it as the cause. Think of a child getting bad grades. Instead of considering the curriculum, teaching methods, family pressure, mental health, people often rush to conclude that they are lazy or unintelligent. That's a simple but wrong explanation. And when we explain wrongly, we act wrongly, like pressing the fire alarm on the 3rd floor while the fire is starting on the 1st. The tendency to oversimplify also leads us to seek scapegoats. If a project fails, we look for a person. If a country is in chaos, we look for a leader. If a negative trend occurs, we find out who started it. This helps the brain feel like the problem has been solved. But the truth is, it only stops at the surface. The world is more complex than that, and every cause has deeper underlying causes. Related to that is another bias, attribution bias, where we attribute the success or failure of others to their personal character, ignoring circumstances. If someone gets rich, we think they are smart, daring, and have business acumen. If they fail, we say they are incompetent, lacking discipline. But if it's us, we cite a bad market, bad luck, or lack of support. We judge others by results and ourselves by circumstances. This completely distorts how we see the world and is especially dangerous when we hold leadership roles or make decisions. Because if we don't recognize the role of the system, we will believe we are rewarding or punishing the right people. But in reality, we are reacting to the surface. Another type of bias, rarely noticed but very common, is the consistency bias. Once an opinion has been publicly stated, many people will cling to it, not because they believe it's the truth, but because they don't want to contradict their old self. Changing one's mind is seen as weakness, fickleness, or lack of conviction, but perhaps that is actually a sign of wisdom. Charlie Munger once said, "Every year I try to change one big belief. If I can't, it means I haven't learned anything." Meanwhile, most of us try to prove that we haven't changed, as if maintaining the same opinion is a sign of strength. This makes us cling to mistakes simply because they were once our choices. And then there's a bias almost everyone has, the illusion of control. We like to think that we control outcomes. That success is due to talent, effort, individual strategy, and that failure is due to personal mistakes. But in many cases, success and failure contain a greater element of luck than we imagine. You can do everything right and still fail. You can make a series of mistakes and still succeed because the world doesn't operate on a simple cause and effect chain. It is influenced by thousands of factors. timing, market, trends, people, geography, technology, crowd psychology. And in each of these factors, probability plays a huge role. The illusion of control makes us overestimate ourselves when successful and be too harsh when we fail. It prevents us from learning from good fortune and from forgiving ourselves for mistakes. It is an illusion that needs to be dissected to understand that most good things in life are a combination of effort, system, and a little bit of luck. So, how do we avoid these biases? In reality, it's impossible to avoid them completely. They are part of human nature. But we can identify them, name them, and thereby reduce their influence. Like a nearsighted person who cannot cure their eyes but can wear glasses to see more clearly. Wearing glasses, in this context, means developing a bias prevention system, not based on feeling right, but based on principles. And one of the most powerful principles is to stop and review before every important decision. Ask yourself, what am I thinking? What makes me think that? Do I have contrary evidence? Am I clinging to emotions, prejudices, or old beliefs? Who can challenge me honestly? If I am wrong, what is the cost? If I am right, could it be by chance? The questions are not meant to make you hesitant, but to help you move forward mindfully. We don't need to eliminate biases completely, just minimize their power in the most crucial moments. Besides that, you need to build a healthy feedback environment. Don't just seek out people who agree with you, seek out people who think differently and respect them for it. A group of like-minded people can create false confidence and repeat collective mistakes. A group with diverse perspectives and a healthy culture of challenge can prevent cognitive disasters. Learn from Charles Darwin. He recorded evidence against his hypotheses as soon as he found it, because he knew his brain would quickly forget or rationalize it to protect his ego. That is intellectual humility, understanding that we are prone to error, so we must actively guard against ourselves. Also, don't blindly trust intuition. Intuition is the result of repeated experience and accurate feedback, like the intuition of a chess player or a surgeon. But in complex environments, without clear and repeated feedback, intuition is very easy to mislead. If you haven't been through hundreds of similar situations, your intuition is not as trustworthy as a simple analysis. A simple but effective strategy: write down decisions before making them. Write the reasons, expectations, and risk factors. Then, when the outcome occurs, whether right or wrong, go back and evaluate. Did I have logical reasons? What did I overlook? Did I fall into any biases? From there, you build a library of mistakes and also a library of wisdom. Good thinking doesn't guarantee you'll always be right, but it ensures that each time you are wrong, you will learn something. You will be less stubborn, less complacent, less emotional. And thus, over time, you become someone less fooled by yourself. Mistakes don't kill you, but an ego that won't admit fault will kill the opportunity to correct them. The world doesn't punish you for mistakes, but for not learning from them. And you will never learn anything if you always believe you are right. The wisest person is the one who knows they are most prone to error. And that very realization, that silent but vigilant fear of biases, is the foundation for the best decisions. Part 3. Physics and mathematics in thinking errors. Errors in thinking don't just come from emotions or blurred perceptions, but also from mathematics. Not because we don't know how to count, but because the human brain isn't designed to intuitively grasp probability, exponential growth, or nonlinear responses. These are things that belong to the world of physics and mathematics, yet they profoundly influence everyday decisions. Imagine you have two choices. 1. Receive 10 million today. 2. Receive 1 cent today, but that amount will double every day for 30 days. Reflexively, many people choose the first option. Why? Because they cannot grasp the power of exponential growth. But if 1 cent doubles for 30 days, the amount you would have will exceed 100 million. This doesn't come from wishful thinking, but from a simple mathematical rule. It's just that people don't intuitively feel that. We don't live in a linear world. Although most decisions are processed as if everything increases steadily, decreases steadily, or fluctuates steadily, the real world, finance, biology, technology, society operates on winding, sudden, unexpected curves. Pouring more water into a full glass doesn't make it spill immediately. But at the last drop, everything breaks, and that is the tipping point, the breaking point, the point that intuition cannot predict. Another example is compound probability. The probability of you getting into a car accident on any given day is small. The probability of you getting into an accident and simultaneously being delayed by rain is even smaller. But if I tell you a vivid story about a friend who got into a car accident yesterday because they were late in the rain, you'll feel that it's reasonable, relatable, and memorable. And then you will assess the likelihood of that happening as higher than it actually is. This is a type of error called the conjunction fallacy, where a complex event is seen as more probable than a single component of it. The brain prefers concrete stories over abstract probabilities. Instead of looking at a 1% probability, we want to know who has experienced it, what it looked like. Do I know anyone who has? But probability doesn't care about emotion. It's just the rule of numbers, unchanging whether we fear or believe. And if we don't understand probability, we will always misjudge risks and opportunities. Mathematical biases also become evident in assessing expectations. You see an investment that could yield $1 billion and you put money into it because it sounds like a large sum. But if the probability of that gain is only 1/10, the expected value is only 100 million. Another investment might yield 500 million with a 50% probability. The expected value is 250 million. So, which is the rational choice? Unfortunately, most people don't calculate, they just look at the impressive numbers. Charlie Munger always said, "Think probabilistically. Don't ask if it can happen, ask what percentage probability it has." But probability isn't as appealing as a story. It has no emotion, no characters, no climax, so we ignore it and pay the price. Lack of mathematical understanding doesn't just affect individuals, it also causes entire organizations and societies to make wrong decisions. Look at how the media reports on risk. If a drug has a 1% chance of causing a side effect, the headline will be, "Drug X could kill." And readers panic, but no one asks, what's the probability? Or, what are the benefits? Or, how does this compare to natural risks? This is when we fall into the trap of statistical illiteracy. The brain is not good at estimating relative risk. We hear that something doubles the risk of cancer and think it's horrific, even if it's from 1% to 2%. The numbers might sound serious, but in reality, the change is insignificant. Just a few sensational words, and panic spreads more widely than the true nature of the risk. Or consider the phenomenon of illusory probability, when a very rare outcome is still believed to be common simply because it's repeated constantly. If we hear stories of lottery winners every day, our brain starts to think that winning the lottery is completely possible. In theory, we know the probability is 1 in millions, but emotion, through images of winners and engaging narratives, makes us believe it's closer to reality. Psychological proximity increases imagined probability. In mathematics, another important thing is nonlinear response, meaning that input is not directly proportional to output. Doubling effort doesn't mean doubling results. Sometimes a small change can create a huge leap, and conversely, sometimes we pour all our energy in, but the result barely budges. If we don't recognize this, we will be constantly disappointed or have false expectations. Think about learning a new skill. In the beginning, you might progress very quickly, but then the growth slows down even if you practice more. Or in weight loss, it drops quickly at first, then plateaus. If you don't understand nonlinearity, you'll easily get discouraged and think you're doing something wrong. While in fact, that's the nature of all complex systems. They have thresholds, limits, and delays. Because of nonlinearity, we also often misjudge the scale of cumulative phenomena. For example, debt. It doesn't grow linearly, it accumulates slowly then suddenly explodes. Or trust in a relationship. It takes a long time to build, but just one bad action can shatter it instantly. And when it shatters, efforts to repair it don't create a proportional recovery. Real-world damages are often not recoverable like numbers on a spreadsheet. There's a profound paradox here. What's easy to measure like profits, indices, time is often most easily misunderstood if we don't place it in a systemic context. And what's hard to measure like trustworthiness, emotions, structural resilience is often overlooked, even though it has a huge nonlinear impact. This misunderstanding leads to strategic biases, investment biases, and sometimes total collapse. Also related to mathematics is the concept of misleading averages. You hear that the average income of a country is 10 million a month, but that doesn't mean most people earn 10 million. In a skewed distribution like income, the average can be pulled up by a small group of extremely wealthy individuals. The majority might be living far below that level. The average says nothing about the actual experience of the majority, yet we still use it as a benchmark for assessment. You have 1 foot in boiling water and 1 foot in ice water. On average, your body is at a normal temperature, but the actual feeling is very different. The average is a deceptive illusion if we don't understand the nature of data distribution. Therefore, when making decisions based on averages, we need to ask, how is this data distributed? Is it skewed? Are there outliers? A particularly dangerous bias arises when we try to predict the future by linearly extending what has happened in the past. If the stock market has just risen 10% in 6 months, we tend to think it will continue to rise like that for the next 6 months. If a child performs well in their first 2 years, we believe they will continue to excel in subsequent years. We love continuation, and that's when we are most easily fooled. In reality, most systems are cyclical. Growth leads to saturation, saturation leads to decline, decline creates adjustment, and from there, it can recover or disintegrate. Nothing lasts forever, but the human brain tends to prolong the present. We imagine today is a slice representative of the entire future curve, and that's when we bet biggest on a wrong model. Consider a typical example, an asset bubble. Initially, there's a reasonable price increase, perhaps due to scarce supply or increased demand. But then, as prices rise, it attracts more participants, not because of real demand, but because of the expectation of quick profits. At that point, the price no longer reflects value, but reflects emotional expectation. And when expectations peak, just a small piece of bad news can cause confidence to collapse like a domino effect. In other words, complex systems have breaking point thresholds at which all accumulated momentum suddenly shifts direction. Mathematics calls it a bifurcation point, life calls it a crisis, and individuals call it, no one expected it to happen so fast. Even in nature, major changes often come from small fluctuations that are amplified. A tornado doesn't start from a strong wind, but from the accumulation of energy at a microscopic scale. This is true for all systems: financial, political, health, social behavior. If we don't understand nonlinearity and accumulation, we will be surprised and unable to react in time. And from here, we arrive at another mathematical concept, the inverse proportion. If your assets drop by 50%, you need a 100% gain to return to your starting point. This isn't a word trick, it's pure mathematics. Decrease and increase are not symmetrical movements, they have completely different consequences. That's why loss prevention is far more important than trying to achieve extreme gains. You're investing. You gain 10%, then lose 10%. You think you've broken even. Wrong. In reality, you've lost money. And if you lose another 20%, you need a 25% gain just to get back to your starting point. The real world is like that. Losses have a greater destructive power than gains of the same absolute value. Therefore, a good mathematical thinking strategy is not just about trying to win big, but about avoiding catastrophic losses. That's why Munger and Buffett often say, rule number 1 is never lose money. Rule number 2 is never forget rule number 1. It sounds simple, even cliché, but behind it is a deep understanding of nonlinearity and the mathematics of loss. Also in physics and mathematics, another phenomenon that can cause misunderstanding is indirect effects, where you change something seemingly small, but it propagates through a chain of interactions to create a large effect. For example, you change an algorithm on a social media platform, thinking it's a minor tweak, but it changes how users respond, what content is prioritized, what emotions spread, leading to societal polarization, affecting elections. We often only see the direct impact, I do A and get B, but indirect impacts are where all unforeseen risks are hidden, and in nonlinear systems, these impacts are not proportional. They are often unexpected, delayed, and cascade. Just like a ball rolling down an incline, the system doesn't always return to its original point after each impact. A small change can push the system into a completely new state, irreversible to the old one. This is called non-recurrence. Many people naively think that when things stabilize, we can return to the starting point, but with many phenomena, there's no going back. You can't heal a relationship back to what it was after trust is broken. You can't erase the impact of a bad business decision once the brand is lost. Damage has structure, and its consequences do not follow linear logic. That's why it's necessary to understand phases of instability, as in physics. When a system exceeds a breaking point, the reactions that occur no longer follow the old rules. You cannot control a tsunami with dam rules, just as you cannot control a crisis of confidence with economic indicators. Errors often occur when we apply rules of a stable region to a chaotic one. A prime example is the global financial system in 2008. Many risk models at the time assumed that fluctuations would follow a normal distribution, meaning extreme events would be rare and have little impact. But the truth is, extreme events occur more frequently than we imagine. And when they come, the models collapse, not due to technical errors, but due to faulty assumptions. Mathematics isn't wrong, the user misapplies the model. This is where we need to mention one of the deadly misunderstandings in mathematical thinking, believing that what is more complex is more accurate. But a more complex model doesn't always yield better results. Sometimes a simple rule, but with high redundancy and flexibility, will survive longer in the real world. Mathematics should be a tool to help us understand, not to replace vigilance and cautious intuition. And like any tool, mathematics can also become a smokescreen that obscures the truth. Take the example of corporate evaluation metrics. A company can beautify its financial figures for a few consecutive quarters by restructuring its books, temporarily optimizing costs, or choosing the timing of revenue recognition. But these actions, though valid accounting-wise, hide the truth about the actual state of the business model. Mathematics here becomes a tool for embellishment, and users of the data, if not vigilant enough, will become victims of the very spreadsheets they thought they were analyzing. And at a deeper level, we face an unavoidable paradox. The more we try to measure and model, the more we risk falling into the illusion of control that we can predict everything, optimize every variable, understand the entire system. But the world, especially the world involving humans, is not a laboratory. It is an ecosystem with thousands of feedback loops, uncertainties, and random elements. This leads us to a key concept in system physics: noise. Not all data contains information. Some fluctuations are random, meaningless, not a trend, not a reflection of truth. But if we can't distinguish between noise and signal, we will overreact to every small fluctuation and fall into a spiral of continuous, unnecessary decision-making. Imagine you invest in a good company for the long term, but just because its stock price drops 2% in a day, you panic and sell. Or you monitor your health metrics daily, see your heart rate slightly increase after a night of little sleep, and immediately worry, research, and change your schedule. This is reacting to noise, not a signal. And in a world saturated with data, the ability to differentiate these two is a vital skill. So, how do we survive in a world full of noise, nonlinearity, and uncertainty? The answer is not to eliminate all risks, but to learn how to design thinking and action systems that are resilient. This brings to mind a concept in physics and biology: antifragility. A bamboo tree survives a storm not because it is stronger than steel, but because it knows how to bend. It doesn't break, it's flexible. Good mathematical thinking in an uncertain world isn't about finding precise answers, but about defining an acceptable margin of error. Instead of asking, which scenario will happen, a good thinker will ask, what is the worst-case scenario? How much can I withstand? Where will my system break? Munger called this avoiding stupidity, because being smart is hard, but avoiding stupid mistakes is already a huge step forward. In finance, this is reflected in not using excessively high leverage, not putting all assets into one channel, and always leaving room for error. In personal life, it's not gambling reputation, health, or trust on uncertainties. And in strategic decision-making, it's about designing choices so that if you're wrong, you don't lose everything. Another extremely effective thinking tool is estimation ranges instead of absolute numbers. Instead of saying, growth will definitely be 10%, say, growth could be in the range of 5–15% with an 80% probability. This not only accurately reflects the inherently uncertain nature of the world, but also helps us avoid falling into false confidence. Mathematics also teaches us about the skewed nature of expectations. When small probability but high impact events occur like wars, pandemics, technological breakthroughs, the expected value of such events is very high, even if the probability is low. This leads to Nassim Taleb's concept of black swans, rare, unforeseen events that have enormous impact. And alas, the world is dominated by these black swans, not by normal fluctuations. Therefore, instead of trying to predict precisely, a solid mindset should always prepare for the unexpected, not in a paranoid way, but by building systems that can endure and adapt, like a mountaineer carrying safety ropes. Not because he thinks he will definitely fall, but because he understands that the most unpredictable thing is what needs to be most anticipated. Another crucial part of mathematical thinking is learning to recognize and react to risk-reward ratios. Not every decision is worth making, even if the probability of success is high, if the reward doesn't justify the risk. Conversely, there are low-probability opportunities where the reward is so great that they are worth trying if the cost of failure is small. This is how value investors, startup entrepreneurs, and even brilliant strategists throughout history have operated. A gamble with only a 20% chance of winning, but if you win, you get 10 times your capital, and if you lose, you only lose a small portion of your assets. In a single instance, it might seem reckless, but if you repeat it 100 times, you are likely to win a few times and generate huge profits. This type of thinking is not common because emotions don't like losing many times to win big, but mathematics only cares about expected value, not feelings. And finally, the most important thing mathematics teaches us in thinking is humility. Because mathematics doesn't let anyone cheat. It doesn't care about beliefs, emotions, status, or personal narratives. It is simply rules, and that is what makes mathematics a cold but accurate mirror, reflecting all the illusions we build in our minds. Understanding the physics and mathematics of thinking errors won't turn you into a superhuman, but it will make you less blind, less naive, less easily captivated by things that sound logical but are completely wrong. Because ultimately, wisdom is not knowing everything, but knowing clearly where you can be wrong. Part 4, A Guide to Better Thinking. After all that has been analyzed, the errors stemming from evolutionary instinct, from psychology, from distorted perception, from mathematics and physics, we face an unavoidable question. So, how do we think better? The answer isn't to become a genius, but to establish a thinking system that can operate better than our spontaneous human nature. That means building a framework, a latticework of thinking, a set of checking tools, a set of operating principles to protect ourselves from the slips of instinct. Good thinking is not a correct intuition. It is a series of deliberate actions. And the first thing in that series is to recognize when you are thinking. It sounds silly, but have you ever stopped in the middle of a decision and asked yourself, what thinking tool am I using to reach this conclusion? Mostly not, because the brain prefers reacting over reflecting. So the first step is to turn on the light. Meaning, be conscious that you are in a situation that requires thinking. Don't act automatically, don't make hasty decisions, don't just feel it's right and follow through. Just a second of interruption, a moment of questioning, is enough to create a new space for awareness. The next step, self-check your data sources. What information are you relying on to make a decision? Where does that information come from? Do you have enough evidence? Are you filtering data according to existing beliefs, or are you truly considering everything? Are you confusing emotion with data? Munger called this a cleaning ritual, like a scientist cleaning a microscope before examining a sample. Then check for biases. Am I prone to confirmation bias? Am I seeking information to reinforce my view instead of testing it? Am I influenced by the group? Am I reacting due to immediate emotion or due to genuine thought? Am I affected by anchoring, misleading averages, availability, loss aversion, or any of the traps from the previous sections? Each question is like a flashlight shining into a dark area. It doesn't guarantee you'll go the right way, but at least you'll know which path you're on and whether that path might be an illusion. Step 4, use multiple models. Don't just look at a problem through a single lens. Ask, what biological model is at work here? Are there any relevant physics principles? What does psychology say? If I look at this as an economic system, what then? If I apply the laws of probability, would the conclusion be different? The more models you use, the less likely you are to be fooled by a single one. Charlie Munger called it a latticework of mental models. where each node is a fundamental model from core disciplines. When a new problem arises, we throw it through the latticework and see which models capture the core essence. This isn't deep specialization but interdisciplinary thinking, and it's stronger than single discipline expertise because it isn't colorblinded by a singular viewpoint. The next step, and perhaps the most important, doubt yourself as if you were your own opponent. Learn to step outside yourself and play devil's advocate. Suppose you are arguing against yourself. How would you attack your own argument? What would you say to dismantle your current belief? Is there any data you're ignoring? Is there any possibility you're underestimating? This is high-level reflective thinking, not just asking, what do I think? But also, where could I be wrong and how would I hide it? Darwin wasn't successful because he had great ideas, but because he didn't fully trust his own ideas. Every time he saw evidence contradicting his hypothesis, he immediately noted it down because he knew his brain would soon delete or distort that information. He understood that the most dangerous enemy of a thinker is not an opponent, but the ego within that always wants to protect what it already believes to be true. Next, you need to learn to detach yourself from the outcome. If you make a correct decision but the result isn't as expected, do you have the strength not to blame yourself? If you make a wrong decision but the result happens to be good, are you honest enough not to take credit? Good thinking requires you to look at the process, not just success or failure. Think of a doctor who chooses a rational treatment method based on all available data, but the patient still doesn't recover. That is not the doctor's fault. Conversely, a doctor who chooses a reckless approach based on intuition and the patient miraculously survives doesn't mean the doctor thought correctly. In a probabilistic world, we cannot evaluate decisions by single outcomes. We must consider the entire context, models, data, and logic. Then comes another principle. When in doubt, slow down. We often equate speed with intelligence and reflexes with wisdom. But in most important situations, haste is the enemy of understanding. If you find yourself wanting to finish a decision quickly, feeling it's right and wanting to act immediately, or fearing missing an opportunity, perhaps that's precisely when you should pause. Time is an ally of thought. Just a moment of quiet to re-examine assumptions, to ask another question, to look from a different angle, can completely change a decision. You don't need to be slow in everything, but you need to know when to stop. Another principle in the toolkit of a thinker is to think probabilistically, not with certainty. This has been mentioned before but deserves re-emphasis. Every conclusion you draw should come with a degree of confidence, not just right or wrong. For example, I believe this is true with 70% probability, instead of I am certain this is true. Thinking probabilistically helps you be more flexible, more open to new information, and less clinging to old beliefs. It also helps you avoid a very common cognitive error. I was right once, so I'll be right again. While in reality, your past success might have just been the result of favorable probability. If you confuse probability with inevitability, you will start making wrong judgments that lead to consequences many times larger. Finally, remember this: don't try to always be right. Try to understand. Those who always try to be right are often defensive, ignore unfavorable information, and distort reality. Those who want to understand are open, listen, update their beliefs, and only those who want to understand are capable of sustainable self-change. Try to imagine you step into a room full of strangers. Each person carries a perspective, a belief, a past. If you arrive with the mindset of, I'm here to win the argument, you will react defensively. You pick a side, you argue, you look for the opponent's weaknesses. But if you step in with the mindset of, I'm here to understand, the entire experience will be different. You listen, you ask questions, you dig deeper. You see things you never thought of before. Good thinking is not a pistol, it's a magnifying glass. It's not for attacking, but for exploring. You don't always need to argue, but you always need to be curious. Curiosity is the smoldering fire that keeps thinking from becoming dogma. And at a deeper level, you need to build a system for identifying situations, a kind of personal cognitive map where you link real-life situations to appropriate models. For example, when you see a phenomenon showing signs of rapid growth, you ask yourself, is this linear or exponential growth? Is there a possibility of a bubble? When you hear someone speaking fluently and confidently, you remind yourself, am I being misled by the halo effect? Continuously connecting models with real-life situations is the only way to put theory into practice. Because if you only know about cognitive biases but don't recognize when they are operating within yourself, all that knowledge is merely an intellectual veneer, nothing more. Charlie Munger called this practicing mental models daily, like muscles. Thinking only develops when used frequently, not through inspiration, but through habit. And that habit starts by always asking, what model am I using here? If there's no model, you're reacting instinctively, and then all biases can sneak in like thieves in the night. Another important point: don't overly trust complexity. A simple, robust, and practically applicable model is often more effective than a system so complex that even its creator cannot control it. The mistake of many deep learners is to think that more models mean more intelligence. But wisdom lies not in quantity, but in the ability to choose the right model for the right context and to discard models when they are inappropriate. A smart person is not someone who knows a lot, but someone who knows when to use what, and when to use nothing at all. Another guide I learned from Munger is to view every mistake as tuition, but unlike regular tuition, this one is useless if you don't record the lesson. That is, when you make a mistake, you need to dissect. Why was it wrong? At what step was it wrong? Which bias appeared? Which model was overlooked? If you don't do that, you'll keep paying tuition without earning any degree. Keep a diary of thinking errors not for self-punishment, but for self-illumination. Over time, you will recognize a pattern: recurring errors, unchanging blind spots, models you often overlook. And it is this recognition of patterns that is the true beginning of personal cognitive evolution. Another principle, simple yet extremely important: when you don't know, say, I don't know. That is not just an act of humility, but a strategy to protect your thinking. Because the moment you say, I know, your brain will stop searching. Conversely, when you admit, I'm not sure, you open the door to new information, you create space for new models, you maintain a flexible cognitive state. One of the rarest skills in today's world is delayed conclusion. We hate ambiguity, so we rush to label everything: right, wrong, good, bad, believe, disbelieve. But there are problems that cannot be concluded immediately. There are phenomena that require more data. There are people who cannot be understood by just one action. The ability to tolerate ambiguity is a sign of a mature brain. Imagine you are reading a report about an emergency situation. Instead of reacting immediately, put your hands down and ask yourself, do I have enough data yet? Is someone emphasizing something and overlooking something else? Is there a perspective I haven't considered? That very moment of interruption, between instinctive reaction and rational action, is where true thinking is born. In a noisy world, quick reactions are often praised as signs of sharpness, but few realize that great minds are often slow. Not slow due to lack of ability, but slow because they don't allow themselves to be cognitively lazy. They are willing to hold multiple options in their minds simultaneously, weigh each hypothesis, and endure uncertainty until the truth gradually reveals itself like the sun breaking through clouds. One more practical principle: when everyone agrees too quickly, be cautious. Too easy consensus is often a sign of groupthink, where people avoid disagreement for fear of exclusion, or simply because everyone assumes someone else has thought it through. The danger here is that no one actually thinks, but everyone thinks someone else has done their part. A good thinking group is one that can debate without destroying trust, where people can say, I disagree, without being labeled as antagonistic. Where challenge is not a threat, but a contribution. And that only happens when the leader knows how to create a cognitively safe space where mistakes are seen as learning opportunities, not reasons for punishment. You also need to learn to evaluate other people's models without emotion interfering. It's very easy to dismiss an idea simply because you dislike the person who said it, or conversely, to be captivated by someone's charisma to the point of believing everything they say without verification. A strong mind is one that knows how to separate the messenger from the message itself. Who says it is less important than what they are saying and what evidence they are providing? Charlie Munger once said, try to learn from people you don't like. If you only learn from people like you will never get out of your own shadow. This is not easy because the ego is very sensitive to dissonance. But if you can train yourself to listen without reacting, you will broaden your perspective and reduce personal biases. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, live what you think. Nothing is more dangerous than a sharp mind with a cold heart. knowledge without ethics is a sharp knife without a handle. It can cut through truth, but it can also make the conscience bleed. Good thinking should not just be a tool for success, but a way to live more kindly. When you think clearly, you will be less likely to hurt others through misunderstanding. You will be less quick to judge, less arrogant, less stubborn. And from there, you become a person who is not only intelligent, but also safer for those around you. And then, perhaps the most essential aspect of good thinking lies not in technique, but in attitude. The attitude of someone who always sees themselves as a student, not an expert. Such a person does not enter the world with a head full of certainties, but with an empty, open mind, ready to be filled with things they don't yet know, don't understand, or once misunderstood. They are not afraid to be wrong because they know mistakes are fuel for understanding. They are not afraid of being challenged because challenge is a mirror reflecting on their thinking. They are not resentful when questioned. On the contrary, they know that if someone cares enough to question them, it is a rare gift in a world that is lazy to think. That attitude, the attitude of continuous learning, is what transforms thinking from a tool into a virtue. It not only makes you make better decisions, but also live a deeper, more generous, less superficial life. And finally, there's something I want to tell you. Something I've learned not from books, but from costly mistakes, real regrets, and moments of confronting my own limitations. No one can think well alone forever. We need others not to teach us how to think, but to help us see what we cannot see by ourselves. An isolated thinking system, however sharp, is easily caught in its own loop. A thinking system that reflects, resonates, and is challenged from the outside will continuously evolve. Therefore, if you want to think better, build a community of thinkers. People who can tell you when you are wrong, people who are brave enough to disagree and kind enough to listen. It doesn't need to be a large group, just a few people. But they must be honest, intelligent, and care more about the truth than about agreement. I've seen that in the lives of people I respect. They don't think alone, they build feedback systems. They invite critique, they learn from both supporters and opponents. They know that in a world shrouded in fog and noise, clarity doesn't come from external light, but from how we ask questions, re-examine assumptions, and dare to see our own limitations. And if you start practicing that, bit by bit, every day from this moment, I believe you will not only be a better thinker, but also a person who creates a deeper, wider, and kinder impact in this world. There are books that don't give you answers but offer you a mirror. Seeking Wisdom is such a mirror. It doesn't instruct you on how to be smart, but gives you reasons to doubt what is called smart. It doesn't teach you who to think like, but forces you to confront the way you are thinking every day, every moment. If you have accompanied me to the very end of this journey, I thank you with profound respect. Not because you listened to me, but because you had the courage to delve into a territory most people avoid, a place where we no longer blame circumstances, but begin to look directly at the shadows within, where growth doesn't come from knowing more, but from understanding how prone to error we truly are. I don't expect you to agree with everything presented in this book. In fact, I hope for the opposite. I hope you will challenge, doubt, and if possible, rewrite it with your own experience. Because true knowledge is not born when we finish a book, but when we begin to write its continuation in our own lives. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting you in the next book.